Welcome everybody to the January 2025 Business of Alt Protein seminar. The seminar today is going to feature a presentation by Henrik Bennetsen, who is a serial entrepreneur and the co-founder of FoodxClimate. The presentation will be on why food is underserved as a climate problem. For those I have not met, my name is Pat McCauley. I'm the Startup Innovation Lead here at the Good Food Institute. I serve as the primary contact for entrepreneurs and startups in the alternative protein space. Before we dive in and I hand the reins to Henrik, I'm just going to run through a few things. First, for those who are unfamiliar with the Good Food Institute, we are an international nonprofit organization developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We identify the most effective solutions, mobilize resources and talent, empower partners across the food system to make alternative proteins accessible, affordable, and possibly, most importantly, delicious. Second, a heads up that we'll be recording the seminar. We post all of the seminars on our YouTube channel. We'll also send out a copy of the recording to everybody that registered. And lastly, these are meant to be very interactive. So please do ask questions throughout as Henrik's presenting and beyond. Henrik will only go for about 10-12 minutes presenting. So we hope that most of this is pretty interactive. So please put your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat. That'll help us sort through and keep track of them. And hopefully we can get to most of the questions asked after Henrik presents. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Henrik Bennetsen, who will start again with a presentation. I will give just real quick a slightly more thorough intro for Henrik. Henrik is a very accomplished serial entrepreneur, as I mentioned. He recently served until about mid last year as the co-founder and CEO of a company called Savor, which has developed novel technology to produce fats and oils without animals, farmland, fertilizer, hormones, or antibiotics. I've had the pleasure of trying actually in Oreo with Savor fat and not dairy fat. That was fantastic. These days, Henrik spends his time building community at the intersection of food and climate through FoodxClimate, which he founded back in 2022. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Henrik Bennetsen, and I'll hand it over to you, Henrik.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for unmuting me, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited, and I just want to start out by also saying that I'm a huge fan of the Good Food Institute and what you all do for the ecosystem, and I'm truly honored to be giving this talk. Actually, much more than a talk, I'm hoping for a discussion. So I framed this initial part where I framed this discussion around some questions. Not because I think I have the ultimate answers to these questions. My talk is much more spurring a conversation around these questions because I too want to know the answers. So why is food so underserved as a climate issue? And I think very importantly, what can we do about it? So I'm trying with these brief notes to frame us into this. So everybody was good enough to say where they were dialing in from. I'm dialing in from Fairfax, which is a small town north of San Francisco, but in the San Francisco Bay Area. But I'm actually from Denmark. I've lived in the States here for about 20 years now. So I'm not the new guy anymore, but very much still Danish to the core. And I heard there's a shout out, someone from Denmark. So it's good to see my people are here. I was working on Sabre until mid last year. Sabre, as Pat says, developed fats and oils, and I think sort of some parameters around Sabre also tells a story of how underserved food is as a climate issue. So fats and oils, if you looked at where we get our fats and oils from, it's basically from plants and animals, essentially. And the annual greenhouse gas emissions from fats and oils alone is about 7%. 7% is a big number. That is on the order of every car on the road out there. So it's big. And as a startup guy, I was interested in how much had been invested into startups that tried to decarbonize fats and oils when I was building Sabre. So I looked into it, and my back of the napkin math showed sort of around and about $100 million. And I think you might struggle if you look across the climate fight to find anything else that represents 7%, like on the order of every car, every single car on the road that has only had that little money invested into it. And when you look across the greater food space, that is the case. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about how underserved food is, as much as I want to understand why, because I think a lot of you on this call already believe this thing. It's fairly well documented. But the motivation for Sabre was how uniquely high stakes food is as a climate problem, because at about a third of annual greenhouse gas emissions, our food systems are a major source of climate change. But what is so uniquely terrifying and was a big motivator for Sabre as well is that our food systems are more volatile than we care to think. And they really are on track to be severely impacted by climate change in a way that's going to lead to this world looking quite unimaginably different. And it's a strong motivator for a lot of us. So if it indeed is so high stakes, that certainly begs the question, how can it then be so underserved as a climate issue? And that's what I was sort of trying to wrap my head around. So I am trying to advance the slide. I did it there. Um, so I asked in a LinkedIn post I wrote that actually there's a link to at the bottom there, and maybe Pat, you'll be good enough, or someone will be good enough to put that link in the chat if somebody wants to multitask. But basically, one way to start to get at why food is so underserved as a climate problem is to sort of say, well, who are these different stakeholders that are working on it and what gets in the way? Because food is such a diverse issue that touches a bunch of different groups. So in this LinkedIn post, I sort of looked at these different stakeholder groups: governments, startups, investors, NGOs, philanthropy, academia. There are other groups that can sort of credibly be stakeholders here as well, but those were the ones I focused on. And then just very, very briefly in this talk, like government, food is a tough issue. It's a divisive issue, even if you believe that climate change is real. As a politician, it takes quite a bit of courage to address our current food production system. So there might be other areas of the climate fight you are more inclined to work in. Startups, as I was painfully aware when building Sabre, the startup space around food technology is in quite a tough space right now. There is very, very little funding available. And a lot of people sort of like to say, well, there was a heyday of maybe, Beyond and Impossible, and there's sort of a heyday of food technology. It's true that up to about 2021, there was more funding available. But I think if you think of food as a third of our climate problem, how high stakes it is, I don't think there has ever been a lot of investment into food technology if you look at it relative to the size of the problem. But right now, we're in a uniquely tough situation where you can sort of see for startups that funding has got desperately down, and a lot of companies that have raised money and are on path to building important technologies in this space may not make it, and a lot have already sort of publicly essentially announced that they're shutting down. So we're in quite a tough space for startups. And meeting this moment is something that takes up a lot of my bandwidth. Investors typically have other investors in them. A venture fund will have limited partners that they get their money from. And we're in this kind of space right now where financially motivated investors really are not investing in food right now, because investors need startups to have exits. And right now, it sort of looks roughly like you can't exit a food company profitably if you look at the current companies in the market. NGOs, when I looked at NGOs and talked to NGOs, it's a space I'm learning about. So, but what I found initially was that I think a lot of NGOs and philanthropies, for that matter, they rather than work on large systemic issues, they will often be addressing more tangible problems, things that are like solving sort of a more tangible problems that you can have a more sort of a simpler to tell story around, while addressing systemic issues is really, really difficult and doesn't yield the same outputs that these spaces are often looking for. So who's going to address the systemic stuff? And if you look at academia, one of these things that seem to be hampered is that academia is organized in a set of silos, essentially. And it seems like the food system is a history that sort of moves horizontally across these silos. So in academia, where you got to publish papers in a domain, it often be hard to address these more horizontal problems, such as food systems. So when you look at it, you essentially have these group of people who all have different pieces of the puzzle to contribute, and for their own idiosyncratic reasons are having a hard time to coordinate an effort to really make progress on it. Which actually kind of takes me to the second part of it, which is the part of it that I think is in my sort of entrepreneur sensibility. I'm very, very interested in getting practical. What is it that we can do about it? What can we do about the fact that food is so underserved as a climate problem? That is actually a discussion I really kind of want to have. And I just want to share a little bit of perspective on it as a way to frame these conversations. One of these things that you sometimes hear people say about a startup is that it should be a vitamin, not a painkiller. And I think it has some application to the food systems, because a vitamin is something that's kind of a nice to have. You take it and maybe you'll feel better in the future. It's a proactive thing that you do. Painkillers a must have. I need relief right now. My head hurts. I'll do anything for my head to stop hurting. So a startup should be a painkiller, because we are having a hard time with vitamins because we don't like to be proactive, really. We prefer to be reactive, sadly. So unless the problem is real enough and hurts enough, there's enough pain. Like, it's hard to really get anything done about it. And I've come to believe that to the mainstream, at least US consumer, food is pretty affordable and quite tasty. Um, we throw about a third to a half of all the food we produce away. So it's hard to feel much scarcity around food, if it's something that's really kind of pretty freely available and most of us can pretty much afford. The reality that I think drives my work, and I think of the work of the Good Food Institute, and I suspect many of you on the call, is that our food systems are actually quite a bit more volatile than we realize. It's an uncomfortable thought, but it's a thought that has not been made very real to us. But there are examples out there. This, I took a screenshot from Green Queen, which I love, by the way, shout out. But it's about a company called Voyage Foods that essentially works on another way to make chocolate. And they have announced quite a big fundraise. And you can sort of see that this is from May 9th, 2024. This is at a time where raising any kind of money to food tech is brutally hard. So why is Voyage Food succeeding where so many people are struggling? Because there's pain. The cocoa bean harvest has all but failed in recent years for reasons that look related to climate change. So a lot of the resilience that's sort of built into the supply chains around cocoa beans are now actually really hurting. And it seems like in a pretty near future, you're going to see the price of chocolate go up, because the way that we're producing cocoa beans is impacted by what really looks to be climate change related issues. So at the Ivory Coast and in Ghana, where most of it is produced, they're seeing these real struggles. So because there's pain, there is funds available. Because Voyage Foods now, because of the current struggles around cocoa beans, starts to look more like a painkiller than a vitamin. That's a good thing to be doing. Now, where does that sort of leave the rest of the food system where such things have not shown up? Do we really need to see pain across the entire food system before anything can happen? That's the question. And I think that's an animating question, right? Because a lot of the issues around climate change seems to be that we're moving towards these tipping points and bad stuff happens. And bad stuff seems to really need to happen before we really are inclined to react. So are we just waiting for some really bad stuff to happen in the food system, or is there anything that can be done outside of it becoming a painkiller in this way? So I really was interested in this piece in the New York Times that ran now a couple of months ago. And it basically talks about how China is investing in new food technologies. And of all people, a group of Republicans were quite worried about it because they felt it had national security implications, that China is investing in these new, more resilient food technologies. And Republicans are worried that if food gets produced by these new technologies in the future, China will we will be beholden to China, who's invested in this thing. And I actually think they're worried for quite good reasons because we have kind of seen this movie before. If you look at other very climate relevant technologies, such as solar panels, electric vehicles. Like China had really invested very heavily in this catalytic way, used public money to build up production infrastructure, and they are now really become dominant in those spaces. And these Republicans, and frankly myself, we're worried that we will cede advantage to other parts of the world who are willing to invest right now because our current system is more volatile than we like to think. And those who are willing to invest proactively right now stands to gain quite a bit of advantage in the future. And I do think we are living at a time where our worldview as the West will always sort of be dominant in a way that's frankly probably kind of historical, um, racist, is now changing. If you follow AI and the development AI, we're right now at this very moment living through something as well, where something has just come out of China that really has just changed people's worldview. There's an AI called DeepSeek AI that it was just announced over the last month that have really sort of just redrawn the map where people like OpenAI and Meta, Google, Microsoft, Nvidia, like large dominant Western companies have been really kind of um, put in a very different competitive situation because of very, very interesting and exciting novel open source technology coming out of China. Mark Andreessen called it AI Sputnik moment, a moment where the West realized, well, other people than us can actually make incredible advances. So a potential what can we do about food being underserved as a climate issue is to say, well, if we frame food security as national security, maybe that is a way to meet this current moment. And that national security is a motivator for the development of interesting new technology is actually nothing new. There's a book I quite like called The Entrepreneurial State, and it basically shows that it's not unusual at all that new technology progress is motivated and funded by national security. In this book, there's this illustration I quite like. It might be a little dated, but I quite like it. She talks about what makes the iPhone so smart. And then she sort of shows that it's really DARPA money and a lot of public money. There's energy as well, but it's a lot of defense. It's a lot of national security that really yielded all these technologies that makes the iPhone what it is. And then you get to see that while what Apple have created is amazing, they are very much building this phone standing on the shoulders of national security money. DARPA, as some of you know, is the American military sort of advanced research arm. And DARPA, you'll see show up time and again in other parts of the army as having invented a lot of these technologies. So you have actually started to see DARPA also invest a little bit in food technology. My company, Savor, I should say my former company at this point in time, but I'm still very much proudly involved as a stockholder, but actually got a grant from DARPA because technologies like Savor are way more resilient and have way more national sort of security implications. But I think by framing food security as national security, I think there is a way for us to start to think about building a better food system and getting to why food is so underserved as a climate issue and what we can do about it. Those were the words of my talk. I'm hoping that we can be interactive from here on out. And again, I really framed this as a discussion around these questions because I want to know the answer. I don't think what I just said is in any way, shape, or form an exhaustive treatise of the issue as much as hopefully a prompt for the discussion that we're about to have. So thank you for letting me have the floor, and I hope to get some questions now.
Thank you, Henrik. Yes, for people listening, please do add some questions into the Q&A box if you have them. One initial one, Henrik, here is, did you say that fats in oil is 7% of total greenhouse gas emissions? And is that
Yes.
included in the 26% that food accounts for?
Yes. So basically, what you're looking at there is if you're saying fat is one of our major macronutrients that we consume and use in non-food applications as well, and you go in and say there's a cow, and the cow, there's protein and there's fat. You look at the fat component of the cow, you isolate that. So yes, fat is 7%, and that is counted in this quarter to a third of the food's total implication in the food system. But fats alone, this one macronutrient represents 7%. So it's a staggeringly high number, especially when you think about that in the future, we're likely we likely have to learn to make protein and we have to learn to make fat. We no longer use maybe a cow as a factory to get protein and fat. It's a grossly inefficient way of doing it, and it has these climate implications. In the future, we have to learn to make these macronutrients in a separate way, in a new way. So what we did with Savor was saying fat is the problem that we're trying to solve. We're trying to make a better way of making fat that is sustainable and very, very resilient and very, very economically efficient. What if we were saying if all fats came from a process like Savers that can be pretty much close to carbon neutral, how much less greenhouse gas emissions will we have? And that number is 7%. And if you go to Saver's website, there is actually there is a breakdown of it that's done by technical minds smarter than myself. But if you go to Saver's website, you can actually see a breakdown of the number and where we have those numbers from. And I think it stands up to scrutiny.
Thank you. I have another one here. The animal agriculture industry is exceptionally well connected and uses its influence through lobbyists to obtain government funding, subsidies, etc., as well to secure favorable legislation and regulations. It is known to vigorously and aggressively counter anything it perceives as a threat. This is, I believe, one of the primary reasons why food is so underserved as a climate problem. What do you think about that perspective?
I think that's uniquely true. And when we talk about how uniquely food producers such as agriculture are able to wield political power and how difficult it is as a climate issue for government to tackle while other climate issues, as I mentioned in my introductory words, are so much more palatable. I think the food system is like so many sort of systems, they will resist change. They will keep sort of the problems alive that they exist to solve. I think it's very, very, very valid that the existing systems um, are resisting. And to be honest, I'm quite disappointed to see a lot of incumbent food companies currently divest from alternative protein now that the space is no longer hot, because the climate harm that they cause are certainly very, very real. And I think they should take more responsibility in solving the problems that they help create. So I believe that question to be very, very valid. And I think if you work inside some of these larger companies, I would love you to see your job as a climate job, to be inside those organizations trying to affect some change, because the food system is a major source of climate change. And to be honest, when I go to food conferences, I often think that the way that the industry sees itself is sort of a problem. It's we're sort of we're playing for the good team here. We feed people and their families, and while that is definitely true, you also cause tremendous harm in how that is happening. And I don't see an industry willing to really grapple with that part. They talk about caring about sustainability and talk about initiatives that is like ExxonMobil building a few windmills whilst, continuing to extract oil and gas out of the ground, which matters way more. So yeah, I think the existing industry has an enormous role to play, and I do believe that they are working to preserve the status quo, which I think in the urgency of this climate fight is just a terrible harm to be causing.
Thank you. So if you are right now, you've alluded to the challenges funding wise for alternative protein companies. If you are an entrepreneur or startup, maybe similar to Savor, that is a few years on, that is fundraising right now, what advice would you give to them?
This is definitely a good question. First of all, I mean, obvious, conserve cash. Like a startup in so many ways is like a vehicle that needs to get to its next funding source to be able to keep moving forward. And that next funding source is hard to see. I will say that other sources of capital than venture capital, now the venture capital undeniably is so far down, and growth capital in particular is very down. Other sources of funding, if you can get non-dilutive funding, as I said, Sabre got some money from DARPA. It's non-dilutive, as in like when DARPA pays you to do research, they don't take shares in your company, unlike a venture capitalist. So it's good money if you can get it. Getting that is a difficult skill. Thinking about other ways to frame food security as national security, I think, is also a way to maybe get creative about it. If in the US, food security seems like something of an academic problem because there's enough of it, so much of it that we throw a lot of it away. There are other parts of the world where that's no longer the case. If you've ever reflected on how come places kind of small, such as Israel and Singapore, are so leading in food technology, well, you can think about how motivated they must be, right? Singapore is such a small land area that if they could produce food without the need for vast swath of arable land, of course, that would leave them much more resilient to food security issues. So I would say look at other parts of the world where food security and national security um, might be way less academic than here in the US, Middle East. There are many places in the world that is both well capitalized and have really issues with current food production methods that are not serving them.
Thank you. Okay, we have one here. There is a bewildering array of government agencies that provide grants. They are very confusing and time-consuming to navigate. Is there some way of consolidating these opportunities and streamlining applications, a clearinghouse possibly? I know GFI, not to cut you off, Henrik, I know GFI has a list of government funding opportunities. I'll link that in the chat, or Kimberly, if you could link that, that'd be amazing. If you don't, I will. But Henrik, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely get some help. I would say that it's first of all, the other thing about it as well, it's very long lead time as well. It's not that venture capital is that fast either. It takes a while to raise venture capital. The idea you sort of roll down Sand Hill Road and come back with pockets full of cash is pretty myth. It takes a long time, but non-dilutive money takes quite a while. And it's a skill. I would very much recommend that if you're starting from scratch, work with somebody who has done it before, and not only done it before, done it in the domain that you work in. So they have some specialized skill. And as always, I would say, if you're an entrepreneur, ask other entrepreneurs who you have seen do this, what they have done. And if anybody looks like they've cracked the code out there, like go ask them. But there are third party businesses who essentially act as consultants who help you write the grants, they help you identify the grants, they help you. There's also sometimes a relationship building with program officers and other things that really goes into playing that game quite well. Take that, take that very, very seriously, and then ask yourself, how do I bring that capacity to the company? And some people bring it in-house. Some people do it so much that they bring it in-house. That's not an insane response to the current environment where commercial funding is so hard to come by. So definitely take it pretty seriously and know that if you are sort of 3 months from cash out, that is might be kind of late to start looking for non-dilutive funding. You want to do that as proactively as you can. It's a vitamin. Treat it like a vitamin, something you do very, very proactively. If you do it reactively, just as you're about to run out of cash, chances are it won't save you.
Thank you. Another one here, out of ingredient optimization, crop development, plant-based foods, fermentation, cultivated meat, what do you see as the area investors should be most excited about, near term or long term?
That's a great question. My sense is they are the most interested in fermentation right now. That cultivation is a very tough place, and alternative protein is in a very tough space. I'm actually of the belief that food technology companies are quite expensive to build right now, and we are in this place where there's like an infrastructure build up, and you can sort of see that in other places, in other areas of entrepreneurship and technology, that when enabling technologies are brought to bear, like all these applications can bloom on top of them. Like an obvious example are things like cloud computing that yielded this whole other paradigm of software that became possible. In the food space, I think we are still in this infrastructure buildup. I feel aware that building companies like Sabre and many of the other food technologies companies you see out there, that these companies need to build a lot of technology, and enabling technologies are missing. And whether enabling technologies are best funded by venture capital or this sort of catalytic capital, such as public money or maybe philanthropic money, um, I am of the opinion that venture capital is not the greatest fit for that. So that is why when I sort of say, can we frame food security as national security, is because I think we actually need to go pretty far upstream. So in so many ways, I'm dodging the question, because the question was what specific technologies is sort of the most exciting right now. And my answer is a little different. My answer is, when this infrastructure build up phase of food technology, in my opinion, that current paradigms of technology don't deliver on the vital components of taste and price currently. So we need to think kind of holistically about it. I don't think venture capital will get us out of the current rut we're in. So we need something that works at the level of systems, is my answer, which is not a crisp answer to the question, but I think the most truthful one I can give.
Thank you very much. I think this question may have gotten cut off a little bit, but I think what it's getting at is what piece of the puzzle is altering consumer habits around food?
That is definitely a question that we debated heavily inside Sabre and inside the food industry and the conferences. I see a lot of talk about it as well, and I think I take a pretty, maybe a too simplistic view of it, but I feel like we know what drives consumer behavior. The reason why you hear people like myself and others in the food industry harp on about taste and price time and time again is that is, whenever you look at consumer motivations, that comes back as a solid number one and two every time. And it seems other things like what the food's climate implications and animal welfare, health, and other things, they're in the mix, but nothing speaks as loudly as taste and price. And so the idea is that until you get taste and price right, chances are things will not change at the scale we need them to change, is what I believe. So I think consumer behavior is actually fairly well understood. um, what motivates somebody to consume a food product. I think it's fairly well understood. The hard part is to get them that better alternative. And that's something I think that makes food a a scarier climate problem, and why I think it's uniquely problematic we aren't investing in it is in a lot of other areas of the climate fight. The energy space, of course, is the predominant one where we get our energy from. It is a deployment problem at this point in time, right? It's we have alternatives. Wind and solar in many markets are cheaper. Nuclear in certain parts of the world is quite competitive. Things like geothermal really seems to be making progress. So alternatives to fossil fuels exist, and it's about the will to use the alternatives we have. I don't know that I think that food is a deployment problem. I don't know that you could say to a mainstream consumer, you can no longer eat this product from animal agriculture because it's bad for the environment. But don't worry, here's something that's comparable on taste and price. I think for a while there, a lot of us were hoping that that was true. You know, people sort of thought that with alternative protein, with Impossible Burgers and other alternative protein, we had alternatives that were competitive on those key parameters. I think we now have to realize that that was never true. I think a lot of us were hoping that that was true. So I don't think that food, unlike other areas of the climate fight, is a deployment problem. We know what drives consumer behaviors. We just don't have the alternatives to give them right now. Therein lies the challenge, and therein lies the issue of why food is so uniquely terrifying as a climate problem, because we're kind of losing on it while we seem to be on the path to winning in other areas if we have the will to use the technologies we have.
Thank you very much. Next one here. Given that animal agriculture is so well connected and intent on maintaining the status quo, in your opinion, what can the alternative protein sector do to gain more traction rapidly and increase its penetration of the market?
I think we have talked about some of those tactics going to other parts of the world. There are other parts of the world. I think in Europe, I am observing more of a willingness to speak to food as a climate issue and seeing more investment into food technologies. I think that's a thing that entrepreneurs need, right? Entrepreneurs need a they need movement. Pain, like we talked about in the beginning, being a painkiller, causes movement, that causes things to start moving around, and that creates momentum that entrepreneurs can leverage. And honestly, right now in the US, there's very little capital available, and I don't know that there's much political will until you maybe start to frame it as a national security issue. Maybe then you can change the conversation. Right now, I would say the smart entrepreneur should be looking at places in the world where this is more top of mind and more central to the agenda. I think it's a very US centric answer. We have a very international audience here today. I'm from Denmark myself, as I mentioned, but the US is not the most conducive environment for food technology right now, as I see it. I think that other parts of the world you would be wise to look at right now, because, as I said, entrepreneurs need momentum and movement that they can harness to offset the status quo. And without that movement, it's hard to generate a wave.
Thank you. From an individual level, what do you think the single most impactful thing we can do right now to help move some of these solutions forward? And maybe this is somewhat relevant to FoodxClimate and what you've been doing. But what are your thoughts there?
I think obviously, I mean, part of the thing that's hard right now is that a lot of these food technology businesses, such as Beyond or others, really aren't working at the level of businesses. So they, even the ones that have managed to go public, struggle to make money and there's not a lot of demand. So being an early adopter of new food technologies and help these businesses become viable, of course, would send a very strong signal to the market. And, unlike a lot of other climate issues where we buy a car rarely or a water heater or something else that are sort of climate relevant, food is a choice that we make like several times a day. So of course you can do a lot there. And I am a flexitarian myself, and I would say that when I look at the impact of not eating certain foods, but eating other foods that are less bad, you don't have to let perfect be the enemy of good there. You can do a lot of good by not eating extremely problematic things like beef. And then also FoodxClimate, because you mentioned that, Pat, is essentially me and others building community for people working at the intersection of food and climate to try and fight together. That first slide, or the second slide that had all these different stakeholders, talks about that part of the problem is that not enough people are working at the intersection of food and climate, and those key stakeholder groups who are quite fragmented. So FoodxClimate is trying to build community to help raise all boats, because I think divided we fall. But if we can work together, you can't build a company like Savor without touching each of these stakeholder groups. That was one of these things I very sort of powerfully internalized when I was building the company. You have to engage with these different stakeholder groups, government. We had like regulatory approvals. There was all kinds of stakeholder groups that you have to touch. To go and find community, you may have a few pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that another stakeholder group can make tremendous progress with. So seek out to become sort of part of some movement. It could be FoodxClimate. It could be other ways to insert yourself at the intersection of food and climate, because it's a cause that needs you.
Thank you. This one is a follow-up to what you were alluding to earlier a little bit, but how do you see Europe's attitude towards alternative foods compared to the US, in both the EU as a whole and single countries within it?
I'm seeing leaning into food as a climate issue and a willingness to maybe. It's not that there isn't discomfort. It's not that the governments in those countries aren't worried about um, going up against essentially food producers. And you've seen things in the Netherlands and other places where there's like very powerful movements in this regard. My strongest lens is probably on Denmark, because that's where I'm from. In Denmark, there are movements to try and put climate labels on food. There are movements to um, invest in food technologies as a climate technology. So I see it on the agenda. And Denmark, there are definitely similarly battles to be fought as well. Denmark is a net exporter of food. And so you're really taking on the establishment if you're starting to say, hey, there is something in our current food system that we need to evolve. But but I'm seeing pockets of political will that I'm not currently seeing stateside. And I think it's undeniable that with the new administration coming in, that the future fate of things like cultivated meat and that kind of stuff is unclear at this point in time. The willingness to invest in climate technology seems to be roughly non-existent right now. So we are definitely at a kind of a moment in time where each of us have to ask ourselves, like, what am I doing here? Because there's no sort of cavalry that's coming like galloping to the rescue. Each of us really have to ask ourselves, how am I participating here? And it's a tough question.
Thank you. What role do existing large food businesses play do you think play in attracting more attention and investment to sustainable food practices or businesses?
That's a great question. I mean, currently, by divesting from a lot of alternative protein, I don't think they're doing the space any favors. I would love them to see it as part of their responsibility to make sure to move the space forward. And of course, the history of kind of change, technological progress, creative destruction of existing industry is also one where incumbent industries felt a little too safe. And then you kind of want to be Amazon, not Barnes and Noble, right? You want to be the one that sort of captures the future. And I think right now there might be a moment where it sort of seems like, phew, this alternative protein wave that we were seeing didn't really materialize, didn't really threaten our core business. So maybe now we can sort of exhale and be a little complacent. But I do think that the thing that's going to change the food industry might be built in a lab right now. It often happens in downturns that very powerful things grow out. So I think the existing food industry should, first of all, realize its responsibility and should learn from other industries. Look at the work of people like Clayton Christensen, talks about how a lot of existing complacent industries felt very safe until they really were not safe anymore. And by the time they reacted, it was too late. So I think you should have a healthy paranoia that the world might change around you when technology paradigms start to shift. I think that's one thing. And then I think there is some tactical things that could happen in the food industry right now. Is like a lot of startups need customer validation, they need partnerships, they need investment, corporate venture capital, other investment, they need to build assets, things that are well known inside large companies. There's a concrete thing that is actually a mechanism in other industries we're not seeing very much in food that I so wish that large food companies would seriously consider, which is a thing called offtake agreements. Basically, entrepreneurs often faced with these chicken and egg problems, right? I have to show market demand, but in order to show market demand, I have to build the capacity to build the product so that I can go and illustrate that there's demand for this. How do you solve these chicken and egg problems? Offtake agreements is essentially a strategic procurement that a large company could go out and say, a company like Sabre saying, hey, you make fat, we consume fat. If we put ourselves on the hook for a legally binding agreement with Sabre or the Sabres of this world to buy your product that you can't yet produce, but you have just shown me in small quantities satisfies like the quality, the taste requirements that I have, and I believe your techno-economic analysis that at scale you can produce this cheaper. If I, as an incumbent food company, put myself on the hook to offtake in a legally binding way product from startups, then the startups can turn around and finance the building of the production capacity. And that is something that's pretty well known in other areas of the climate fight. These offtake agreements is how startups get past this chicken and egg problem. So I would love to see the advancement of the food industry as a shared project between large food companies and startups in a way that sort of says, like, we can actually learn from what people have done in other domains. I think there's something of an exceptionalist tendencies in the food industry to say that with food it's different. There's nothing we can learn from elsewhere. I don't think that's true. I think there's plenty that can be learned from elsewhere, and large companies, I think, would be wise to do so.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Another one here. Any thoughts as to whether, as an industry, we've focused too much on solutions for end consumers that, as it turns out, are quite skeptical to technology being in their food, as opposed to technology solutions upstream in the value chain, and that consumers won't see?
I think that harkens back to a previous answer about the infrastructure um, build out. I do think um, we are in this phase where you have to think about infrastructure. One of the things you often say about startups is that you should build the picks and the shovels for the gold rush. You shouldn't be out there digging for gold. You should be this enabling technology that would enable a sort of a thousand flowers to bloom while a bunch of other people go out there and dig for gold, and you make money and everybody out there digging, whether or not they find anything. I do think that enabling technologies is definitely a very relevant way of doing things. Also, I think some food companies right now are thinking about what they're building, whether that has application in the bioeconomy and elsewhere. You might find yourself that you're enabling technology have application in other domains. I know that some startups are looking at that right now. So it's definitely a good time to be thinking about whether you can sort of that there are picks and shovels needed in this industry, and if you could be an enabling technology as opposed to maybe the thing that the end consumer needs, that might be a pretty good tactical consideration right about now.
Thank you. Well, I think we have time for about one more here, and then we'll wrap it up. And to end on hopefully a positive note here, what gives you the most hope about the future of food systems as it relates to climate?
The people working on it. I do think that's where I get my hope. And I do think that is one of those things that should be said, that a lot of people working in these spaces can find it hard to preserve hopes. There are a lot of things around climate change that seems uniquely terrifying if you're paying attention to what the scientific community, they're roughly shouting in our faces at this point in time. So it can be hard to preserve hope. The thing that gives me hope is that human ingenuity and resilience, sometimes you talk to some entrepreneur and they tell you what they're working on and they're like, it's so smart what they're thinking about, and there's a great solution, and that gives me hope that there are people right now working on these problems with solutions that nobody had thought about before, that wasn't even sort of a technology that maybe even thought that somebody thought was relevant to food, or can dig out some indigenous wisdom from years past that's like hugely applicable to this moment in time, that the human ingenuity can find a way forward, and when faced with tough odds, that we'll find a way forward if enough good people are believe the problem enough and start to say it is very underserved as a climate problem, the food system, and here's my idea of what we can do about it. That's the thing that gives me hope. So, and it's much needed hope, I would say. Hope can be a scarce commodity, but I am fundamentally hopeful.
Amazing. And thank you for all you're doing. And thank you for joining us here today and all the amazing insights. That was incredible and fantastic. So thank you. And thank you to everybody that has lasted this long and listened to us and attended and asked some amazing questions. We tried to get to as many as we could there, but thank you for participating. As a reminder, we will send out the recorded version of this. We'll post it on our YouTube channel. We'll also send an email copy out to everybody that registered. So thank you again. As the Good Food Institute continues to drive progress in this space, we genuinely encourage you to share any ideas and feedback with us anytime. You can email us at corporate@gfi.org, or reach out to any one of us directly. Henrik, thank you again. Everyone that joined, thank you again. And I hope everybody has an awesome rest of your day, wherever you are around the world. So thank you so much.